This is Luke Paulson, the Catholic Conservative, and welcome to the news of the week for July 19th, 2025. And if you enjoy these videos, do not forget to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe for more. FBI bungled Epstein. An insider has revealed to O'Keefe Media Group, probably not by choice, that the FBI bungled the Epstein investigation. It seems that the rank-and-file agents suspect this, and leadership knows this. We have been told that there was a list and that there is no list. This comes after Attorney General Pam Bondi was caught on camera saying that there were thousands of hours of footage. There may have been a lot of records that were destroyed, but something tells me that someone in the FBI knows enough to get justice for Jeffrey Epstein's victims. However, the deep state does not want that secret out. They probably had a talk with this administration about it.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
Even President Trump fanboys are having trouble with this, so let us talk briefly about how President Trump is handling this. Epstein Backlash. Turning Point USA gave a lot of pushback to a certain member of President Trump's cabinet. In this case, Attorney General Pam Bondi. Her choice to say that the Epstein list was on her desk before saying that there never was a list was a gut punch to so many people who desired justice. Since then, President Donald Trump has doubled down on his support for AG Bondi, stating in part that people need to let the Epstein situation go. President Trump prefaced this by talking about his successes, which have no bearing, and the situation in Texas that he is dealing with, which also has no bearing. In my humble opinion, President Trump is falling into the same trap as his first term, but only to a much smaller degree. The problem may be that he is listening to all of the wrong people. As King Solomon said, "He who walks in the company of the wise will become wise, but a companion of fools will be destroyed." Listening to the wrong people kept President Trump from being even more successful the first time around, and now it may be limiting him again. Now, do not get me wrong. He has had a lot of successes and will undoubtedly have more, but he may be getting in his own way. On the other hand, if you want to be even more conspiratorial, President Trump, as of the writing of this script and to my knowledge, never technically denied that the Epstein client list existed. I really think that although President Trump wants to destroy the deep state, he has to work with them for the time being. In other words, he has to work in the system to destroy it. That is why the big beautiful bill needed all of that pork. It was the only way to win. Speaking of conspiratorial ideas, let us talk about the Texas flooding. Texas and Operation Popeye. If you think that you can always trust the official story given by the government or these big corporations,
I got some oceanfront property in Arizona. From my front porch you can see the sea.
I would like to introduce you to Operation Popeye. This was a real military operation during the Vietnam War, and even the brains who dreamt it up knew how controversial it would be. It involved seeding clouds to lengthen the monsoon season to destroy the infrastructure of the North Vietnamese. Even today, we have cloud seeding that can do wonders for a drought-infested area. A company backed by Peter Thiel of Palantir Technologies seeded clouds in the area a few days before the flooding. Granted, the official story is that not only does the seeding stay in the clouds for mere hours, but it is only a small amount of rainfall over a large area. However, it has been said to never let a good crisis go to waste. If the Epstein list announcement was coming out a few days later, it would be the perfect opportunity for a crisis to try and keep attention off of it. The problem is that more people are awake than ever before. And if you believe that our government would never do something like this,
Please consider the phone.
the Tuskegee experiment, wherein our government wanted to test the effects of syphilis and used African Americans as guinea pigs, leading to countless deaths. Desert Rock, in which our soldiers were to stand next to a nuclear bomb to test the results. The Gulf of Tonkin, in which an attack was faked to drag us into the Vietnam War. Operation Sea Spray, in which the government sprayed California with a bioweapon to test preparedness. And those are just a few examples. Marjorie Taylor Greene is even proposing legislation to make cloud seeding illegal. I am not sure that Congress has authority over this, unless it can be proved that seeding would affect multiple states. Either way, big corporations and rich people are never held accountable, even if all of the evidence points to them. The same thing applies to USAID and how they helped create COVID-19. COVID delivered to China. Supposedly, prairie dogs are dying en masse from the bubonic plague. However, before I talk about that, we need to revisit the China virus pandemic. This so-called conspiracy about the China virus only got deeper. Not only did Anthony Fauci fund the Wuhan lab in question, we now know that the United States, through the recently decommissioned USAID, sent viruses to the Wuhan lab. It sounds like something out of a spy movie, except it is real. Our own government sent 11,000 viruses to the lab that would experiment on them to make them more virulent. The virus got its nickname because it came from China, but it seems as if it might have been made in America and only augmented in China. The government is adept at breaking people's legs and selling them crutches. Then they will demand thanks for said crutches. In this case, the entire economy was shut down. The worst part is that liquor stores stayed open, but schools were closed. Police gyms were open, but private gyms were closed. If America truly is in the middle of a new outbreak, will Americans cower just as they did before? Or will they stand up and say,
We will not go quietly into the night. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
well, that was a series of heavy topics. Let me break this video up with a lighter topic. TSA Shoes. The Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, has yet to stop a single criminal. People have gotten through, but were stopped by all of the other measures implemented. However, travelers can now breathe a sigh of relief as these mall cops will no longer force you to remove your shoes. I wear steel-toed boots, and so it might be a bit harder for me. But I can just switch to my dress shoes when going through their unconstitutional checkpoints. Since not only has their security theater accomplished nothing, but private companies are more successful, I can only wonder why this agency still exists. However, while our airports are locked down as if they were military bases, our southern border was so open and porous for the longest time, and certain criminals do not want to be arrested for it. California's marijuana slaves. Immigration and Customs Enforcement recently came across a farm in which children were being used for slave labor to harvest cannabis. I am not going to comment on the use of that drug here. What I am concerned about is the child labor that should appall every single American. These children are brought across the border and were just delivered to an adult with no oversight. Some children, such as these, were put into forced labor. Others had a fate worse than death. The only reason that this slave camp was able to run is because the border under the Biden administration was so porous. Even Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas could not give a definitive answer on where all of these children were. ICE is presently being very heavy-handed, but for good reason. How many other children are trapped by vile criminal organizations? Despite their good work, ICE agents are being doxxed by people who are wearing masks. In response, these agents started wearing masks, and now the liberals are comparing them to unaccountable mobs. It would have been a lot easier if these illegals had just taken the plane ride back to their home country. After all, they were already waving foreign flags while they rioted. Now let us talk about foreign policy by going to the tariffs on Brazil. Brazilian tariffs. A friend of mine decided to stock up on coffee before the tariffs hit Brazil. President Trump has levied a 50% tariff on them, and so the price of coffee is expected to skyrocket. However, buying coffee from American farms, such as Hawaii, is far too complicated. I am not going to pretend to understand all of the geopolitics of the situation, but supposedly it comes down to a spat between our president and theirs. Either way, this is an excellent opportunity for American producers to be able to grow this crop. This will support American jobs. I do not really see the downside of that. I pay more for locally grown fruits and vegetables because I support America. Now let us leave foreign policy and go to domestic policy. No more indoctrination department. I do not call them public schools. There is nothing public about them, as many of them shun parental oversight. I just call them government schools. Much more to the point. Now the Supreme Court has ruled that President Trump can begin implementing the destruction of the Department of Education. Technically, he can just start ending positions, but this could lead to eliminating the entire department.
One can only hope.
But without the Department of Education, what will happen to the schools of America?
Nothing.
All the department does is distribute grants and ensure equal treatment, neither of which really has to be done by a special federal department. Scores are falling across the nation, but more funding never fixes the problem. Most districts honestly will not notice a difference, and they will be able to keep money in their own district or state rather than fixing everyone else's problems. One of the main things that Hitler did was make homeschooling illegal so that he could mold the minds of children. Even today, homeschooling is illegal in Germany. So in other words, it is getting harder and harder to compare President Trump to Hitler if there is no federal control over education. It is one more lie that the media industrial complex perpetuates. Speaking of lies, let us move on to the medical industrial complex. Johnson & Johnson spills the beans. James O'Keefe has done it again. Now he has gotten a representative of Johnson & Johnson to say the quiet part out loud. They never actually tested to see if their vaccine was safe and effective. That sounds like what he got Pfizer to admit. It might not be safe, leading to the myriad of side effects that you are not supposed to talk about. And it might not be effective as you need to keep getting unsafe boosters. The fact remains that at any point, Johnson & Johnson, which bills themselves as a family company, could have pulled the plug. But they were more concerned about profits than anything else. Ironic that the conservative has to call out big business. I guess liberals only hate big business when it is convenient. Now I want to end this week's video on some good news. I have not done that in a while. Candidates at the pulpit. President Lyndon Baines Johnson was perhaps one of the worst presidents in American history. He is at least in the bottom 10 in my opinion. One of the worst things that he did was to create the so-called Johnson Amendment. Basically, this forbade churches from making certain political statements or endorsing particular candidates directly from the pulpit. The then Senator Johnson created this to keep preachers from disparaging him or his party. We saw this down in Houston, where sermons were subpoenaed. Yet they did not feel the need to go after sermons from imams. And we know that these pagans generally have a stronger opposition to sodomy. Liberals must be so mixed up, as they do not know whether to endorse the Muslims who want to throw the sodomites off of buildings, or the sodomites who are being pushed off of buildings. Either way, a new ruling by the Internal Revenue Service allows candidates to endorse a particular candidate. The so-called wall between church and state is a one-dimensional wall created to keep the government from regulating the church, but more importantly, for the church to hold the government accountable. The government fears a knowledgeable public, and now preachers have the legal power that they had before LBJ got involved. Maybe I'm just blowing smoke. Maybe I'm completely off my rocker, but that is just my opinion. And do not forget to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe for more. But before you go, on the left I have last week's video, but you may also enjoy the video on the right.